The bicycle rolled to a stop at the edge of the open field. The rider had noticed something pale and still ahead of him, the kind of shape that didn't belong out there. From a distance, it looked like a mannequin dumped in the grass. He pedaled closer, then froze. What he was seeing was a woman's body, unmoving, exposed to the open air. He backed away, shaking, and went for help. Officers and paramedics arrived near the west side of the 3800 block of Landings Drive in Fort Collins, Colorado. In the grass, they found 37-year-old Peggy Hettrick. She was a nurse, someone with co-workers and friends who expected to see her again. The coroner would later conclude she died from a stab wound to the upper left area of her back, likely in the very early hours of that morning. Detectives also saw that her body had been sexually mutilated in a way that looked deliberate and controlled, the kind of damage that suggested more than rage in the moment. It suggested intention. Before the bicyclist ever stopped, a teenager had already passed the same spot on his way to school. Timothy Masters was 15 years old, a thin sophomore who sometimes cut across the area to save time. At daybreak, he saw the shape in the field and made the same first assumption the bicyclist did. Mannequin, prank, someone's sick joke. He kept walking. Hours later, as police canvassed the neighborhood, Tim's father mentioned his son had taken a slightly different path across the field that morning. That detail, small and ordinary, landed hard in an investigation that had almost nothing else. From the start, the case was built on what police could not see. No one came forward saying they witnessed Peggy attacked. The scene didn't hand detectives a clear suspect. Investigators collected what they could and tried to build a timeline around Peggy's last hours, looking at the people closest to her, including a boyfriend, Matthew Zoellner, whose name surfaced early in the investigation. But the evidence didn't line up neatly. 2 hairs recovered from Peggy did not match Tim Masters. Unknown fingerprints were found in Peggy's purse, and they did not match him either. What the police had was a dead woman in a field and a teenager who saw her and didn't report it. None of that stopped the focus from tightening. Detectives treated Tim's failure to report the body as if it could only mean one thing. He told them over and over that he thought he'd seen a mannequin. A polygraph test didn't give investigators the clean answer they wanted, coming back inconclusive, which meant it could be used as suspicion instead of clarity. The pressure continued, and the story of the case began to shift away from what happened to Peggy and toward what kind of person Timothy Masters might be. When police searched Tim's home and his belongings, they found what would later dominate courtrooms and headlines. They seized thousands of pages of writings and drawings from his room, his backpack, and his locker. Some of it was violent. Some of it was sexual. There were knives, too, a collection that sounded sinister when described in a report. In ordinary life, it might have been dismissed as a teenager trying on darkness, trying to shock, trying to feel powerful. In a murder investigation, it became a substitute for the one thing the case was missing: proof. Detectives searched hard for anything physical, blood in sinks, trace evidence on clothes, anything tying him to Peggy's body, but none of that emerged. As weeks turned into months, the case cooled and then stalled. Detectives kept circling Tim anyway. They questioned him through high school, then tracked him after he enlisted in the U.S. Navy and left Fort Collins. They consulted with profilers and tried to shake loose a confession without having the hard facts to force one. At one point, investigators planted false details about the case in a newspaper story and watched for Tim to react. He didn't. Years passed, and Peggy Hettrick's murder stayed unsolved even as one suspect remained fixed in the department's sightline. Detectives later latched onto another piece they believed only the killer would know. Investigators learned that Tim had talked about the nature of the mutilations, details police believed had not been publicly released. When confronted, Tim said he heard it from another student, a friend connected to explorer scouts who had helped police search early on and who had been told what investigators saw. That explanation checked out, but the case had already taken on its own momentum, and momentum is hard to stop once it has a target. By the late 90s, Fort Collins police still had an unsolved homicide and a suspect they never stopped circling. Detective Jim Broderick contacted forensic psychologist Dr. J. Reed Meloy. Meloy did not interview Tim. Instead, he studied the seized writings and drawings and concluded some images represented Timothy Masters reliving the murder. It was interpretation, not physical proof, but it gave the case a narrative that could be repeated with confidence, especially in a courtroom where jurors wanted a reason that made sense of something senseless. In August 1998, more than 11 years after Peggy Hettrick was killed, Timothy Masters was arrested. At trial in March 1999, the prosecution leaned heavily on the artwork and on Meloy's testimony. More than 1,000 pages of drawings and writings were admitted into evidence. Jurors were asked to see a murder hidden inside a teenager's pages. What they did not have was DNA tying Tim to Peggy, or blood evidence, or a witness placing him with her. The case was circumstantial, but it was emotionally powerful, and the verdict was severe. Timothy Masters was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prison became years of insisting on innocence, while the public moved on believing the case was solved. From behind bars, Tim fought for evidence to be re-examined and for DNA testing that could cut through opinion. Over time, the case began to crack. Information surfaced that had not been provided to the defense before trial, including expert views that did not support the psychological reading of the drawings. And in January 2008, DNA testing on preserved evidence from the original investigation delivered the cleanest fact the case had ever produced. The DNA excluded Timothy Masters. A judge vacated his conviction. Prosecutors moved to release him, and the state later dismissed the charges. After nearly a decade behind bars, Tim walked out into a life that had been interrupted and reshaped by a murder he did not commit. In June 2011, the Colorado Attorney General formally exonerated him. Peggy Hettrick's family was left with the same emptiness they had carried from the beginning, now sharpened by another realization. The system had focused on the wrong person for years. The murder remains unsolved. Other names have floated through the file and through public reporting, including a nearby eye surgeon, Dr. Richard Hammond, arrested years after Peggy's death for secretly filming women in a bathroom and who died by suicide days later. But no one else has been charged with Peggy's killing. The Field Off Landings drive became ordinary again, while the case stayed open, holding a brutal murder, a wrongful conviction, and a killer who slipped away. Tim Masters had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a permanent verdict delivered on drawings and theory instead of forensic certainty. Once that conviction collapsed, it forced an ugly rereading of everything that came before it. The early tunnel vision, the years spent chasing a teenager, and the time that could have been spent building a case against the person who actually met Peggy in her final hours. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.